So I want to talk about a very enigmatic individual, somebody whose name usually pops up in conspiracy theorist circles regarding the terrorist events of September 11, 2001, and that's Dov Zakheim. Um, Dov Zakheim was uh, he was a number of things actually. He worked for the United States government uh, during the Reagan administration and held a number of positions within the Department of Defense. Um, he's also a businessman, an author, um, and he has a very almost a questionable motive regarding his priorities regarding foreign policy, especially. So, but I also noticed that he is at near the main precipice of conspiracy theories regarding um, remotely controlling the aircraft regarding the flights that were hijacked. Now, this is something I entertained for quite some time and something I have not totally dismissed. Now, yes, there were hijackers, but um, one thing that I try to make sense of is that um, let's just say one of the pilots had cold feet and decided not to go through with it in the middle of the hijacking. Uh, Obviously, that person wouldn't crash into either the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. Um, so I could see why remote control could be a possibility. Um, Now, this is something I would like to talk with somebody who's familiar with Boeing airliners. I was thinking about maybe um, conducting an interview with somebody that works in the uh, mechanical field regarding Boeing, and I've always thought about that for a bit. But I do want to talk about Dov Zakheim because I want to clear the air regarding the more rabid theories because I can't picture Dov Zakheim somewhere in some room holding a joystick controlling these planes. Um, there's no evidence for this, and yet a lot of people, not a good decent number of people in the truth movement, um, actually think that that was the case, that he's out there controlling these planes. If that was the case, and these planes were remotely controlled, what happened with Flight 93? Because Flight 93 actually crashed in a field in Somerset County, Shanksville. So, but I still don't throw out the idea that, or the notion that that could have been the case. But what I want to do is bring some sanity regarding Dov Zakheim. Now, of course, I think his foreign policy is insane, but we'll get into that in a bit. But I do want people to understand who Dov Zakheim was because not many people really are familiar with his background. Um, so Dov Zakheim was actually born in Brooklyn in New York in 1948, December 18th, 1948. His parents actually escaped communist rule in the Ukraine and Lithuania. Um, his mother actually um, entered the United States uh, at a young age in 1923, and she was from the Ukraine. His father is actually a very prominent religious authority in Lithuania, and he also fled under communist pressure. In an interview that Dov Zakheim did with Big Think in 2012, he said this about his father, quote, um, he was a leader of the Jewish community there. He was actually legal counsel. And he was tipped off that when the Soviets moved in, this was before the Nazis attacked Russia in 1941, this was 1940, that he was on the KGB, or that it was called the NKVD back then. He was on a hit list because he was a leading anti-communist, end quote. Dov Zakheim's father was Jacob I. Zakheim. He was an active member of the group called Betar, which was a revisionist Zionist movement formed in Riga, Latvia, in 1923. The group actually would later form with other Zionist crime syndicates, mainly the Ergen and Stern gangs. Dov Zakheim, in his late teens, enrolled in Columbia, where he would earn his bachelor's in government in 1970 and his doctorate in economics and politics at St. Anthony's College in Oxford University. Now, of course, while he was there, he studied politics, especially foreign policy, and he really liked working in this sector. And he actually worked very hard at it, and in the hopes that he would one day work in at some capacity for the U.S. government. But he was still dedicated to religious studies and became a 16th generation rabbi. His parents weren't very religious. I mean, his parents were quite religious, but weren't practicing their faith in earnest. Dov Zakheim actually was really somebody who adhered to the faith. And in that interview he did with Big Think in 2012, he said this about his practicing faith, quote, "I was really brought up on God and country. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm a 16th generation rabbi. My son is now the 17th generation of one of my sons. None of our family for the last up to 100 years has practiced as a rabbi. My father was a lawyer, as I mentioned, but we believe in religious values. So on the one hand, we have God. And on the other hand, we have this wonderful country that had made a home for both of my parents, who obviously would probably never have met if it hadn't been for the United States," end quote. Now, fast forward during the period of 1981 and 1987, and Dov Zakheim would go on as an adjunct professor at the National War College in Yeshiva University, Columbia University, Trinity University, where he was a presidential scholar. From here, it would lead him to high positions within the government throughout his whole adult life. Now, during the Reagan administration, he would hold a multitude of positions, including the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Planning and Resources from 1985 to 87, where he would also hold influence in Israeli matters. Now, that's important because this actually lends to his very privileged position of being a dual citizen of not just the United States but of Israel. Now, this would, of course, be highly problematic because as he's entering into the fold of foreign policy in the United States government, he has a very almost biased position regarding the current status that he's in. Nevertheless, Zakheim argued that Israel and U.S. interests would be best served by having Israel purchase F-16 fighters rather than investing in entirely new aircraft. And in 1987, he would hold positions like being a CEO at SPC International, which is a subsidiary of System Planning Corporation, which is a high technology analytic firm which produces military electronics such as radar, systems engineering, and technical assistance in air warfare, cybersecurity, program management, and research of advanced weapon systems for the United States. Department of Defense. And he also sat on a number of major Department of Defense panels, including its task force on defense reform in 1997 and the Department of Defense first board of visionary of overseas regional centers between 1998 to 2000 or 2001. So he had a very burgeoning background experience regarding the more sensitive areas of the not just the Department of State, but also not the State Department, but also the Defense Department of Defense. A more interesting point of time was February 19, 1998. A group called the Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf, which is a bipartisan group made up of largely foreign policy specialists. And they sent an open letter to the president, President Clinton, Bill Clinton at the time, to use the military to help Iraqi opposition groups overthrow Saddam Hussein and replace him with a U.S. friendly government. And the U.S. Basically forbids such an operation. They lawfully cannot do that, but doesn't stop them from still trying to manipulate or influence Clinton. Now, the group is led by, among others, former Representative, a Democrat out of New York, Stephen Solars, and prominent Bush advisor Richard Perle, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and nefarious dual citizen of Israel and the United States, and one of the more hawkish foreign policy neoconservatives in the Bush cabinet. And many of the co-signers of the Bush letter, the Clinton letter, will become the core of the Bush administration's neoconservative national security apparatus. And the co-signers are the more dubious, more nefarious neoconservatives that you probably have heard some of them. Elliot Abrams, Richard Armitage, John Bolton, Stephen Bryan, Douglas Feith, Frank Gaffney, Fred Eichel, Robert Kagan, Zalmay Khalilzad, William Crystal, Michael Ledeen, Bernard Lewis, Peter Rodman, Donald Rumsfeld, Gary Schmidt, Max Singer, Caspar Weinberger, Paul Wolfowitz, David Wormser, and of course, Dov Zakheim. The plan would be held up in its entirety by Clinton, who thought the plan itself wouldn't be feasible. Now, many of the co-signers will go on to high-ranking positions within the Bush administration just a couple of years later. And most of these co-signers are, of course, neoconservative and also dual citizens of Israel and the United States. The letter brought to Clinton was quite remarkable in its entirety, which included the following: U.S. support for Ahmed Shalabi's Iraqi National Congress as the provisional government to replace Hussein's dictatorship, funding the INC with seized Iraqi assets, designating areas in the north and south as INC-controlled zones, and lifting sanctions in those areas, as well as, and by the way, the INC is the Iraqi National Congress, which is headed by Ahmed Shalabi. Also providing any ground assault by the INC forces with a systematic air campaign by U.S. forces, please positioning U.S. ground force equipment so that as a last resort, they have the capability to protect and assist the anti-Saddam forces in the northern and southern areas of Iraq. And of course, bringing Hussein before an international tribunal on war crimes charges, and that happened in 2003, where they captured him in a hole in the ground um, in Iraq. Um, Interesting to note that most of the points I raised regarding the Clinton paper was in 1998, and most of that, most of those points actually came true. So in September of 2000, neoconservative think tank Project for the New American Century writes up a blueprint for the creation of a global Pax Americana. Um, the document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century was written for the George Bush neoconservative team even before the 2000 presidential election. And it was written for future Vice President Cheney, former Defense Secretary um, Donald Rumsfeld, and the future Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, as well as Florida Governor and Bush brother Jeb Bush, as well as Cheney's um, former Chief of Staff Louis Libby, and of course Dov Zakheim would be one of its declaratory co-signees while holding a position in the Department of Defense at this stage of his life. The Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf, which I'm just going to say the CPSG, the acronym for short, they were closely aligned with both the neoconservative Project for the New American Century, which I'll call PNAC, and the Neoconservative American Enterprise Institute. These are very influential entities, some of the most powerful, influential dual citizens of Israel and the United States. These people have a huge sway of what goes on with American foreign policy through the AIPAC lobby, the Israeli lobby, through the Zionist Organization of America, which is the second largest Israeli organization in the United States. And you have the neoconservatives, and these are Christian evangelicals. Zionists, that's what they are. They're Christian Zionists and nationalists. So you have Israeli nationalists and Christian nationalists. And the biggest Zionists in the world are in the United States. So with this dual citizenship between Israel and the United States, you could see how people like Dov Zakheim can basically switch off or can commiserate with both foreign policies of the United States and Israel, even though their foreign policies have similar identities. Israel basically itself doesn't want global imperialism. The members of the State Department, some of them do, and that is basically through the Pentagon and also through major corporations. That's what the government really is. It's a courtocracy. But getting back to Zakheim, in 2001, under the Bush administration, Zakheim would hold the position of the comptroller of the Undersecretary of Defense until 2004. He would also head the investigation under the non-allocated $2.3 trillion that went unaccounted for in the Pentagon. Now, this is something that is also brought up by 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And it's basically just a misunderstanding. I hear this all the time, and it's basically through no fault of a lot of these people because they're listening to the wrong people. People like Christopher Bolin, Rebecca Roth, Loose Change, they purport that the money is missing. I'm just going to give you some common sense. If the money was missing, Why would Don Rumsfeld come out on September 10th and announce that they couldn't allocate this money? Just because it wasn't allocated doesn't mean that it's totally missing. It was not appropriated properly. And this investigation went back years. It wasn't announced in 2001. Actually, the Associated Press broke this story in March of 2000. I'll link that to the bottom of the comment section in this section below the video. Now, Department of Defense financial experts, Zakheim said, are making relatively good progress reconciling the department's lost expenditures, trimming them from a prior estimated of 2.3 trillion to 700 billion. After the attacks of 9/11, however, Dov Zakheim actually was still a leading figure at SPC, which is the System Planning Corporation. The website is dysfunctional. However, it has previously stated, quote, initially SPC staff focused on research and studies in the areas of arms control, nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare, advanced technologies, ballistic missile defense, and continuity of government. Soon, SPC branched into the manufacture of electronic systems, prototyping and manufacturing radar systems to precisely measure the radar cross-section of the new generation of stealth platforms. As a result of this work, SPC emerged as a major leader in the low observable community, end quote. Of special interest to the topic of this conversation, however, is a little known system called the radar and measurement technology, which the classification is known as the flight termination system. Again, this goes back to what I said earlier about the conspiracy regarding remote control planes. The flight termination system, or the FTS, was designed by the SPC's radar physics group. And it is a system which is to destroy target drones or other aircraft in the event of a malfunction or like a miss during military or like a miss during military or weapons testing. The FTS is a fully developed system that is capable of like monitoring and remote controlling, interacting, and terminating aircraft. Not only that, though, the system could be used on commercial and military jets, in addition to the standard drone aircraft, right? Because we still have a group of people in the truth movement that still believe these planes weren't hijacked, but they were drone aircraft. Well, drone aircraft aren't the size of 757 planes. In fact, the largest drone aircraft was built just 2 years ago. And it still isn't the size of a Boeing. Yes, these planes were hijacked. People were on those planes. They made calls on those planes. Hardly any cell phone calls were made on this plane. Most of them were airphone. These planes were hijacked. And again, it's speculated by some 9/11 theorists that Dov Zakheim had control of the FTS systems and the hijacked planes. But just remember that it's only speculation whether he did or not. And like I said before, you'll have to still explain Flight 93 because it crashed in Shanksville. Not an entirely impossible scenario, by the way. So I'm not dismissing it. Now, there are documents formally posted on the SPC website, and what I'm going to do is link the LinkedIn link regarding the System Planning Corporation. The SPC website confirmed that both Eglin Air Force Base and Florida MacDill Air Force Base had been official customers of SPC and the FTS technology. Florida McGill was part of the Boeing Pentagon tanker lease agreement that saw at least 32 Boeing 767 aircraft transferred to the U.S. military. And of course, something I want to get into regarding what happened during the September 11th attacks of 2001 and shortly afterwards. And this is also attributed to Dov Zakheim when it comes to theorists. Now, this is something that is factual, by the way. And it's also myself, Nelson Martins, Ryan Dawson have elucidated through our written work, through videos and films regarding Dov Zakheim's role with the quote unquote dancing Israelis. They were only called dancing Israelis by the media. They were actually called the high fivers by the FBI, just to make it official. Now, of course, Zakheim is unceremoniously beheld in a myriad of suspicious and unconvincing speculation regarding that before this, but with the arrest of the 5 dancing Israelis, regarding the earlier Beyond the Lookout profile that was that gave interest to when the North Tower was attacked. There was a eyewitness who lived in Dork Towers, which is in Jersey City, and she was at a very high floor. I don't know which floor it was, but from this Dork Towers, you could see downtown Lower Manhattan clear. So this eyewitness, her name is Maria. I know her last name, but I'm not going to mention it because her last name was redacted in the FBI report. But I found out her last name anyway because there was her last name was actually unredacted in one part in the FBI reports. So anyway, she sees 3 men on top of the white van, this Urban Groove Citizens van. They're cheering and they're celebrating, and she calls the police. Well, not right away. She waited for her husband to come home from jury duty, and they agreed to call the police. There was a Beyond the Lookout profile regarding these individuals, and at about I want to say 3:30, there was this white truck that said Urban Moving Systems on the side of the truck that was seen by officer of the East Rutherford Police Department, Scott DiCarlo. There was another officer there. I wrote about this, and I can't remember his name. Scott DiCarlo goes before the driver's side. The other cop goes on the passenger side, and they tell the driver to get out. They didn't get out, and so they dragged Sivan Kurzberg, the driver, out, in which he tells Scott DiCarlo, "We are not your problem. The Palestinians are your problem. Your problems are our problem." What made him say that? I'm still perplexed. That doesn't make sense, by the way. None of that does. But the 5 individuals arrested were Oded Elner, Omar Mamari, Sivan Kurzberg, Paul Kurzberg, their brothers, and Yaron Shmuel. Now, later in the weeks to come, they failed their polygraphs. Omar Mamri, who's the youngest, actually cries and tells, after they lied to these people, lied to investigators, he basically weeps, and he's considered like the weak link. Now, the major suspicion here is that they have prior knowledge about the attacks that took place. There's also 2 eyewitness reports that said that they saw a white truck in the parking garage area, which is outside. It's not inside. There's not a garage. We're outside on top of this Doric Tower. So there's the towers. There was this garage, so they could see Lower Manhattan too. So basically, 2 of these eyewitnesses who have their names redacted basically said at 8 a.m. they saw a white truck there. Whether it was them, whether it was a part of them, I don't know. However, that truck that was pulled over at 3:30 basically was not the same truck that was seen by these two people, because that truck actually, and this is in the FBI reports, that truck had an easy pass, and I think it was at 8:11 a.m. Don't hold me to it. I'm going by memory. My memory's shot. Try to remember all these things, but the Easy Pass had them at the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel at that time. If they got there in time, they just got there. Maybe a little later. No one knows. I don't know. Couldn't tell you. That's still a little iffy, but strange, because it's not known whether that was the same truck. Now, the FBI interrogates these people for weeks, and they're held on immigration violation charges because they don't have, they have expired U.S. tourist one visas. Sounds familiar? Because that's exactly what some of the hijackers, the Arab hijackers, had. Actually, Nawaf al-Hazmi had an expired visa. A lot of these hijackers, the muscle ones anyway, they basically had no expired visas because they came very much later. And a lot of these hijackers too, a lot of these applications, I want to say approximately like 12 of them, were actually held in suspension by a U.S. consular officer named J. Michael Springman. You probably heard that name before, but J. Michael Springman held these applications in suspension because a lot of these people, these Arab men, couldn't speak English and didn't know where they were going and couldn't tell them where they were staying at. A lot of these guys didn't even have money until they got to the United States. So we go back to these 5 Israelis. They're held on immigration violation charges. However, they're released under constant pressure from 2 unnamed U.S. congressional leaders and Dov Zakheim, Secretary of State Richard Armitage, along with Harvard Chair Alan Dershowitz, acting as a mediator between the FBI and Israeli interests. The FBI actually didn't want to let go of these guys, even after 71 days. They said that these guys knew more than what they were alluding to investigators. Now, ABC News will later report that there was a high-level negotiations between Israeli and U.S. government officials over the 5 men, resulting in a settlement that they would be deported back to Israel, where in 2004, they would do a live TV interview with Yair Lapid and claim to have documented the event and didn't dismiss the notion that they knew what was happening beforehand. Because one of the questions by Yair Lapid was, were you there beforehand? And they didn't say no. Now, the mystery regarding the Israelis' release were not met, and thus numerous proffers of speculation are still unchecked and numerous. And meanwhile, the FBI would they didn't want to release these guys. With the onset of the U.S. military's invasion of Afghanistan, Dov Zakheim had hopes that this would be a concentrated effort from the Bush administration. However, a large contingent of these people wanted Iraq, where Zakheim actually went against the grain. There's a group of dedicated neoconservatives called the Vulcans in the Bush administration. That's Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and Donald Rumsfeld, where Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice labeled the foreign policy advisors under Bush uh, the Vulcans, which Vulcan being the Roman god of fire. Um, I don't know what uh, really precipitated that, but nevertheless, um, Zakheim um, would write for the American Interest, which is a bi-monthly magazine focusing on U.S. foreign policy. And he wrote um, an article entitled "The Man with the Tin Cup" in 2011, where Zakheim saw the immediate change from Afghanistan into Iraq as the primary disaster, which incidentally still continues to this day. And I'll quote you from the article. Our real problem, quote, our real problem with regards to Afghanistan, however, was not our official stingy allies, but ourselves. As attention and prospective resources shifted toward Iraq, the Bush administration, through the Office of Management and Budget, vastly underfunded the Afghan reconstruction effort. The administration was requesting only $7 billion in assistance for Afghanistan in 2004, just a fraction of what we anticipated asking to support the Iraq operation. This was nothing new. The total value of American assistance to Afghanistan in the fiscal year of 2002 budget amounted to 942 million. This was probably 500 million short of what was needed that year. But analysts might have argued that the country could not absorb more money at that time. The initial fiscal year of 2003 allocation, however, totaled just 151 million, with foreign military finance reduced to a laughable $1 million. I'm going to also put that link in the article at the bottom of the description box. And so Zakheim would just continue to expand his ventures within the State Department, and over the years, Dov would actually be given a high-level position at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a defense contracting agency, where he would serve as the vice president until about um, 2009 or 2010. And he's currently a senior fellow at the CNA Corporation, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also the co-vice chair of Global Panel America. And in 2016, uh, Zakheim, along with 52 other Republican foreign policy dignitaries, signed an open letter condemning Donald Trump as being unfit for office, which I find to be quite amusing, considering that Bush wasn't that far off. But then again, Trump doesn't have the neoconservatives, nor the CPFG, or the Vulcans behind him. Zakheim had feared that when Trump would declare generation war on terrorists abroad and have Japan as a strong U.S. ally. Um, but his fears, of course, are unfounded. Um, Trump will be very lauding in regards to Israel and its tentative ally, Saudi Arabia, anyway. Um, so, in regards to Dov Zakheim and his dual citizenship, uh, there is an article, and this I think I might put in the description box, which would probably illuminate the point I'm making about the problem of having dual citizenship with two countries who have such uh, who are such a detrimental um, effect regarding current U.S. foreign policy. In this article, Zakheim submitted that for a religious Jew to work in foreign government, one had to appear as if he is of its counsel. And the quote that he had taken was from the Avodah Zarah, which is a tractate of the Talmud. And I'll quote it. Quote, "It appears, therefore, that a Jew need not actually be in government service to qualify as a Karov Lemalkut, kingship. Through all of the aforementioned cases involved persons who were in frequent, if not constant, contact with the governing authorities. Indeed, when Maimonides expands the exemption to include shaving, presumably with a razor, he explains that for a Jew who is Karov Lemakot and must sit before their kings, it would be an embarrassment for him if he does not appear like them, clearly implying that the Jew mixes regularly with officialdom." End quote. Interesting regarding the devious nature of serving two different masters, even though they share a commonality, as you could see with the current position regarding Israel and the United States. It has been an absolute travesty and a disaster regarding most of the Arab world.